Story 1. All I can say as a medievalist is that if you have an eating disorder or struggle with self-harm, think twice before you read saints' lives because they can be extremely triggering, for example, Catherine of Siena's case. We can debate whether modern concepts like anorexia nervosa are adequate in a medieval context, but I would argue that in some cases behavior that we consider self-harming could have stemmed from trauma. Take, for example, Saint Radegund, who had a chaotic childhood in Thuringia and was eventually taken to Gaul by Clothar I, who later married her and killed her last surviving brother. She managed to get away and became an important political figure in Poitiers in her own right, all the while engaging in extreme asceticism and self-harm. Also, I do not know if it counts as a disorder, but I am convinced that Saint Izarn, abbot of Saint Victor of Marseille, 1020 to 1047, died from pancreatic cancer. The last chapter of his Vita is heartbreaking. I have many interpretations about 11th century Provence, so take it with a grain of salt. Story 2. I watched a documentary about Marie Antoinette, and listening to the records about her upbringing reads like a list of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder symptoms. They said that she was clever but lacked focus, was often impulsive, and frustrating to teach. She has also been treated unfairly by history, but that is another matter. Basically, she was not that bad. I suspect her husband, Louis XVI, was either gay or struggling with serious depression as well. It seems like they really cared about each other but were not in love or physically attracted to each other. They did not deserve what happened. Story 3. Every single saint from the early church. I love them, but God, were they an unhealthy group of people. How many times have I wished I could go back in time and send Saint Augustine to therapy? If I ever write a historical fiction novel, it will be about that. Story 4. Lots of postpartum depression is going around. No one really talks about it, but Isaac Newton almost certainly had bipolar disorder or something similar. The man was moody as hell. Though who among us has not threatened to burn down our childhood home with our parents inside? On the same science theme, Henry Cavendish might be the most obviously autistic historical figure of all time. Story 5. After reading Prairie Fires and Pioneer Girl, Laura Ingalls Wilder showed many traits consistent with autism. Story 6. Maurice Ravel, composer of Bolero, was believed to have suffered from a mental illness that caused him to become obsessed with a musical phrase. As his illness progressed, the obsession grew. A modern example is a woman who was a painter. At some point, she began painting horses and became obsessed. Eventually, painting horses was all she could do, and by the end of her life, she had lost the ability to paint anything else. Story 7. Percy Bysshe Shelley. His biography is remarkable. He suffered from hallucinations when he was younger. People called him Mad Shelley. He was apparently the inspiration for Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein because of his sometimes cruel experiments with electricity and gunpowder. I believe his father wanted to have him institutionalized at some point. Story 8. All of them would be diagnosed with medical issues because it is impossible to get through life without some health problems. After Queen Victoria died, her doctor, who had visited her daily for years, examined her body post-mortem and discovered that she had a prolapsed uterus and a hernia. Neither the Queen nor the doctor had ever considered a proper physical examination, and she had never mentioned any problems. She could have been diagnosed and treated in her own lifetime if she had been able to mention all this to the doctor. Psychiatric disorders include Henry VI. Story 9. Going the opposite direction, I think Joanna of Castile, known as Joanna the Mad, was actually sane. She grew up in a very close and loving family, and at age 16 was sent to Austria, never to see her siblings or mother again. She fell deeply in love with her husband, Philip the Handsome, and gave birth to 6 children. But Philip had been taught that women had no part in ruling, while Joanna's mother was a reigning queen and crusader who had power over her own country and went on battle campaigns while pregnant. Philip was not as in love with Joanna as she was with him, so he had many affairs. This was expected for medieval kings, but Joanna was very upset and jealous. When Joanna's mother died, Joanna became Queen of Castile and Philip became king. Her father Ferdinand was not okay with this, and the terms of her mother's will stated that Ferdinand could continue ruling if Joanna could not or would not. This is when people started suggesting Joanna was a bit crazy. Philip and Ferdinand fought over control of Castile, upsetting Joanna, who loved them both and was the actual ruler of Castile. In the end, they came to a secret agreement that Joanna's infirmities and sufferings made her unfit to rule, so one of them would have to rule. Then Philip died, and at the same time, plague and famine arrived in Castile due to harvest failure. Joanna, already grieving, struggled to maintain control. Her father stayed out of it initially, letting things worsen, then intervened to restore order. The royal council decided that Ferdinand should be king over Joanna's objections, and he took control of Castile. He confined Joanna to a small palace, dismissed all her servants, and replaced them with people who reported everything back to him. Around this time, stories appeared that Joanna took her husband's body with her. It is unclear whether she actually did or whether these were rumors to portray her as losing her sanity. Joanna was confined for the rest of her life, even after her father died and her son took power. She had no one she trusted and believed some of the nuns she was with wanted to kill her. She began to struggle to eat, sleep, or bathe, which suggests understandable depression. She died at age 75 after 46 years of confinement. Now she is remembered as a crazy woman who had to be locked up. Story 10. Anais Nin may be somewhere between neurotic and borderline histrionic in the psychoanalytic sense, where neurotic means normal functioning and borderline means between normal functioning and psychotic and narcissistic. An example: her father left her family when she was 10 or 11 years old. She reconnected with him as an adult, seduced him, then left him as revenge for leaving her as a child. Story 11. I'm surprised no one has mentioned Genghis Khan. It is true that war was more brutal when he lived, and there were many actions considered normal then that would get a general thrown in prison today. But if he wasn't a violent psychopath, then who can we legitimately call a violent psychopath? Story 12. Stonewall Jackson from the United States Civil War was known for intense obsessive-compulsive disorder and hypochondriac tendencies. I personally would consider him to have some characteristics of autism as well, but that is just a casual observation. Story 13. George Patton was brilliant when he was younger. He helped develop tank warfare. However, he later became eccentric, held strong animosity toward the Russians, was extremely tactless, and was unfaithful to his wife Beatrice with a much younger relative. Story 14. It might be harder to list those who were normal. There were many insane kings and emperors. Of course, what is really normal? Story 15. Tesla would definitely be on the autism spectrum. He had some very specific routines and obsessions. Story 16. Van Gogh had extensive experience with psychiatric care during his lifetime. If he had been born later, he would most likely have been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Story 17. What is the official diagnosis of Charles Manson? Was it psychopathy, a version of narcissistic personality disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, neurodivergence, or something else? Story 18. Choose a saint. Any saint. While not all, most would meet diagnostic criteria for a condition. Story 19. Greta Garbo and Jacqueline Kennedy were both anorexic. Their obsession with food, calories, and deprivation reached the level of a disorder. Story 20. Karen Armstrong is a religious writer and former nun. She wrote about epilepsy throughout church history. I recommend all of her books. Story 21. Edvard Munch, painter of the Scream, is thought to have suffered from borderline personality disorder. This is a retrospective diagnosis, so take it with a grain of salt. He had severe mood swings, bouts of anxiety, and abandonment issues. One notable aspect of his life is his on and off relationship with Tula Larson. She pursued him, he rejected her, then changed his mind, and then changed his mind again, refusing to see her before he eventually proposed. During one of their arguments, he somehow shot off his left thumb. A while later, he discovered that she was married and succumbed to raging alcoholism. Story 22. Saint Francis of Assisi had schizoaffective disorder and manic depression. He gave away all of his clothing and died from leprosy and tuberculosis. Story 23. I am in the middle of reading The Hammer of Witches. Heinrich Kramer had serious issues. He was a psychopath for sure. Story 24. Today, the bar for diagnosing prominent figures with psychiatric disorders, at least formally, seems quite high. Story 25. Let's face it, the Apostle Saul, also known as Paul, was unusual, as was the person who wrote the book of Revelation, although it was not the John that many people assume. Story 26. Most people who were fanatical about any religion, especially if they had claimed any divine experiences such as visions or voices. Story 27. Probably most of them, especially if they died in bed. We have learned about many medical conditions in the last 50 to 100 years that humanity never knew before. If doctors from today could go back in time, they could probably diagnose many illnesses until they collapsed. Story 28. I was always sad that the movie Troy eliminated the character of Cassandra. I had high hopes that they would have an actress playing her as a schizophrenic woman, seeing visions and desperately warning her family in an incoherent, hysterical way about everyone being burned alive and a horse with men inside. Story 29. The Apostle Paul was likely bipolar or schizophrenic. He experienced hallucinations or fabricated a whole new religion that has caused untold suffering in the world. Story 30. There are many signs that Salvador Dali had narcolepsy, but virtually nothing was known about the disorder at that time. Story 31. H.P. Lovecraft was a person who experienced significant anxiety. His books are often considered racist because he feared many things, including people of color, water, cold drafts, and colors. I am not an expert on him or psychiatry. Story 32. Surprised no one mentioned Harriet Tubman. She would likely be diagnosed with a concussion and schizophrenia based on the visions she claimed to have received. Story 33. I traveled back from the year 2045 to answer Donald Trump. By the way, this kind of thing costs a fortune, but I spent the money on the time travel booth for the benefit of all of you. Story 34. Canada had a prime minister named William Lyon Mackenzie King who meticulously journaled about seances, crystal balls, and communicating with spirits such as his mother's, other political figures who had died, and his past dogs, all named Pat, who had passed away. He also accomplished significant achievements for the country and held the position for 21 years. Story 35. Gaius Julius Caesar likely had epilepsy or a cardiovascular issue with similar symptoms. He is recorded as suffering from 4 seizures. 1. When he was offered a crown. While listening to a speech given by Cicero. While on campaign against Pompey's forces in Spain during the Civil War. When on campaign against Metellus Scipio and Cato the Younger, also during the Civil War. Story 36. Is anything known about Hieronymus Bosch? I would be very surprised if he was neurotypical looking at his art. Story 37. Not sure if someone mentioned this before, but Virginia Woolf likely had bipolar disorder presenting with psychosis along with other disorders. Story 38. Isaac Newton was highly intelligent and exhibited traits associated with autism spectrum disorder. It is unclear how much this represents a disorder versus a difference, but it is still quite remarkable. Story 39. Isaac Newton, possibly autism spectrum disorder. He was intensely focused, socially isolated, and had rigid routines and traits often linked with high-functioning autism. Abraham Lincoln, depression. Story 40. Have you read American Prometheus? The biography used as the basis for the Oppenheimer movie. If you read the book, Oppenheimer was most likely on the autism spectrum, probably type 1. Story 41. King Christian VII of Denmark, nicknamed the Mad King, was abused as a young child by his courtier and teacher Dietlef Reventlow. His teacher and tutor were very strict and focused on discipline. In addition, he showed signs of schizophrenia from adolescence. Story 42. No one specific, but since being diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and finding out how much overlap there is with autism, I often think about monks shutting themselves away to avoid talking to anyone and hyperfocusing for 17 hours a day on intricately detailed illuminated manuscripts. Then they might get bored and draw, for example, man-sized rabbits fighting a nun who is armed only with a giant, detached object in the margins. Story 43. I am unsure if religious figures count, but I am pretty sure that if you said God was talking to you and telling you to do things on his behalf in this day and age, you would be sent straight to the hospital or maybe even the police. Story 44. I do not know what exactly was wrong with Vlad the Impaler mentally, but I do know that anyone who tried to figure it out was going to get impaled. Story 45. Rube Waddell was a professional baseball player who chased any fire truck that came by the stadium. Marian Zajanček is a great story. This man put a lot of miles on. Nonetheless, he probably was bipolar and manic depressive. Story 46. Jesus of Nazareth was literally a doomsday cultist and preacher. One of the reasons why Christianity grew the way it did was that the notion that the world was ending was quite common during the Roman Empire with its many crises. Story 47. Are people really not saying Sabbatai Zevi? The man would become manic and claim he was the true Jewish Messiah, then become depressed and stop. Story 48. Any religious leader with visions or Emperor Justinian II. He was deposed in 695 and had his nose cut off. He returned in 705 driven by revenge. Story 49. Nikola Tesla. The man was optimistic. While he was intelligent and created many things, some of his inventions were not practical. Story 50. I have heard some medical experts theorize that Abraham Lincoln had Marfan syndrome, specifically because of his height, lanky build, and prominent cheekbones. This is somewhat unlikely due to his lack of heart problems. If that is not considered, then I would say he most definitely had depression. Interestingly, there is an entire Wikipedia page on Lincoln's health, which states that his longevity challenges most of these theories. Story 51. Most old kings would likely be labeled as sadists and psychopaths by modern standards. Reading about history is distressing. Story 52. Stalin experienced severe trauma inflicted by his father. He had webbed feet and a badly injured arm that could be treated by an orthopedic surgeon. He suffered from paranoia and was likely depressed at various stages of his life. Story 53. Joan of Arc. One of the most astonishing episodes in history. A teenage girl has great ideas and gains an army to carry them out, supported by temporarily sidelined royalty. She succeeds for a time. Story 54. They believe Tutankhamun was probably epileptic among other conditions, and that is likely what caused his death. He had a seizure and fell, resulting in fatal injuries. Story 55. Mozart may have had attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I am not an expert on either, but he was pretty erratic, terrible with organization and money, and just listen to his music. He was massively hyperfocused when composing as well. I feel like this one is fairly obvious. Story 56. Post-traumatic stress disorder affects nearly any ancient or medieval soldier or knight. Imagine what it is like to stab a spear or sword into another man and watch him bleed out on you as he dies. Then do this repeatedly during a battle and in many battles over and over again. The victors are covered with the defeated soldier's blood and body fluids. It is like being an axe murderer for a living. Interestingly, Roman legionnaires and Spartan hoplites tended to be older, while medieval knights could be as young as teenagers. Think of medieval armies as well-armed and semi-organized street gangs. I wonder which age group would be more susceptible to post-traumatic stress disorder. Story 57. Sadly, even historical figures alive today are not accurately diagnosed. One obvious example right now is Donald Trump. The issues with him are numerous, but no one will release the real details, likely because of national security concerns and because people do not want to lose their jobs. To be fair, I am sure Joe Biden has some of his own disorders, aside from the recent cancer diagnosis. Story 58. I scrolled for a while and did not see it mentioned, so hopefully I am not repeating someone else. Leonardo da Vinci probably had attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, chronic procrastination, high distractibility, and late work. 2. Extreme curiosity and hyperfocus. 3. Nonlinear thinking. 4. Restlessness and poor time management. 5. Non-standard sleep and activity patterns. Edited to add, I did not scroll far enough. Story 59. Abraham Lincoln, depression. Mary Todd Lincoln, bipolar disorder and possibly a touch of schizophrenia. Nero and Caligula, narcissistic personality disorder. Vincent van Gogh, possibly schizophrenia. Nikola Tesla, obsessive-compulsive disorder, autism, and epilepsy, based on his descriptions of visions as flashes of light. Story 60. I reckon a lot of philosophers would be internet nut jobs in the modern world, but Friedrich Nietzsche comes to mind. Even his writings before his breakdown seemed spastic and impulsive in tone, frantic and paranoid. He spent the last decade of his life in a mental institution after a head trauma, where he wrapped his arms around the neck of a horse being whipped and was injured on the head. Even before that, he was a sickly man and traveled around Europe hoping to improve his condition through climate. He grew up aristocratic and was a child prodigy, like many philosophers. Fun fact: his sister married a Nazi. Nearing the end of his life, when his sister was his guardian because he was deemed unfit to care for himself, she used much of his work to further Nazi propaganda, even though Nietzsche seemed to believe in radical individualism. Story 61. Adolf Hitler losing one of his balls and starting a world war? I mean, calm down, Karen, and eat a Snickers. It is not always about you. Story 62. Nikola Tesla was autistic. Vincent van Gogh was probably bipolar. Abraham Lincoln probably suffered from depression. Howard Hughes had obsessive-compulsive disorder. Winston Churchill struggled with substance abuse disorder and may have been bipolar. Story 63. Shakespeare. Not sure what he would be diagnosed with, but the whole time we were reading his works in high school, I kept saying, "This person needs therapy." And my English teacher wholeheartedly agreed. Story 64. Dr. Samuel Johnson, compiler of the first English language dictionary, most likely had obsessive-compulsive disorder and Tourette syndrome. For example, he had elaborate rituals he performed when passing over a threshold. He would never step on cracks and insisted on touching every post he passed while walking. Additionally, he was reported to be constantly making ruminating motions and noises with his mouth, such as half-whistles and clucks. Story 65. Emperor Caligula. It is less of a theory and more of a proven fact that some of his notoriously erratic behavior came from brain damage he suffered due to lead poisoning. The Romans used lead for wine mugs, so many Roman nobles poisoned themselves over the years. Story 66. According to an article I read not long ago, General Bernard Montgomery could have had Asperger's syndrome. This would explain his constant difficulty, stubbornness, and numerous conflicts with other allied military and political leaders. Story 67. Heinrich Kramer, also known as Instatories, wrote the Malleus Maleficarum, or Witch's Hammer. He must have been completely irrational. Story 68. I did a research project on paranoid personality disorder. Many historians are convinced that Joseph Stalin, Saddam Hussein, and Richard Nixon all had this disorder. Story 69. Genuinely curious because I am not familiar enough with him as a person, but would Nikola Tesla qualify, or would it be considered more as personal eccentricities? Story 70. Joan of Arc, Catherine of Siena, Hildegard of Bingen, Theodore Géricault, Vincent van Gogh, Michelangelo. I could continue, but all of these are assumptions based on records of these people. Story 71. The issues caused by inbreeding in the Habsburg line of European royalty, particularly in Charles II of Spain, resulted in severe conditions including a malformation of his jaw, known as the Habsburg jaw. In this condition, the lower jaw was overgrown and much more prominent than the upper jaw. He also had teeth and palate malformations, an overgrown downward-pointing nose, and a large, hanging lower lip. He experienced eating, breathing, and speech difficulties throughout his life. In addition, he suffered from cognitive problems, intellectual impairment, epilepsy, digestive issues, and sexual difficulties. Other family members experienced skeletal deformities, limb malformations, and what appeared to be compromised immune systems. Story 72. Harriet Tubman would likely be considered schizophrenic. She suffered a head injury when she was 13, then began to have visions and hear the voice of God. She credits these voices for inspiring her activism. It is also highly likely that Joan of Arc had a similar condition. Story 73. Martin Luther said Satan was living in his bowels and claimed to see him appear in front of him. He also experienced intensely productive manic periods and extremely low depressive episodes. I have heard that today he would be diagnosed as having bipolar I disorder with psychotic features. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.